In this class, we're going to make the stand for the cabinet. And we're going to make 4 square legs. So I want to take a moment and show you how to mount these hubs so that you'll get maximum material usage when making a square leg on the ornamental mill. The indexing hub needs to be centered and square to the part. The indexing hub has 4 holes that are spaced 0.7 inches apart. So we'll take the part and measure the width. In this case, it's 1.75 inches. You'll minus the 0.7, and that'll give you 1.05, and divide that by 2 to get 0.525. Then we'll take this part and simply scribe lines on each side. Next, you'll take a pencil and darken in these lines and, of course, drill the 4 holes like we've done on this part. And then when you mount the hub, it will be square and centered to the part. The parts that we're using for this stand actually measure 2.1 inches. So if you take 2.1 minus 0.7, you get 1.4. And then you take half of that, you'll get 0.7. And then, of course, you would scribe these lines the same way. This technique will work to center the hub on any size square part. I've inserted the part into the machine and I've engaged the indexing pin here. But we've got a problem. The part is not square to the machine. If I put it to this hole, it's tipped back this direction. If I put it to this hole, it's tipped back that direction. It's not level. This is where using the double locking collar makes it easy to synchronize your square part to your indexing. We'll simply loosen this side of the double locking collar, and then we can rotate the part and slip that index drive center. Once we get it square to the bed, and we'll go ahead and lock this back down. The easiest way to ensure that the part is square is to take the surface planing bit and turn it 90 degrees and lower it down until it just rests on the surface of the wood. At this point, I'm going to zero my scale and I'm going to lower this down about 25 thousandths of an inch. And we'll make a test cut here. At this point, I'll measure the thickness of the stock and then make an adjustment to the plunge depth and cut this till it's 2 inches square. All right, we're at 2 inches, so we'll take this part out and repeat this process on all 4 parts. You can see by centering and squaring the hub, we'll get maximum material usage. We only needed to remove just a few thousandths in order to make this part square. It's a good idea to mark one of these tabs that line up with the double locking collar. So when you take these parts in and out, you'll make sure that they always come back to the same location. Now let's take a close-up look at the part as we laid it out using the design kit. At the headstock end, we're going to make a cut right here at 5 inches using bit number 3934. Then we're going to use that same cutter and we're going to mill a bead at this end. At 31 inches we'll make this cut, and at 32 inches we'll make this cut to form the foot. And while the bed is still set level, we'll machine the mortises here on the end. Then we'll set the bed on an angle and cut the tapered section. We'll plunge the bit down to the shoulder of the cutter. It just rests on the surface of the wood. Then set the stop for the plunge depth. Now we'll set the carriage at 5 inches on the x-axis, and we'll go ahead and make this cut. Now we'll repeat this step on all 4 parts. From the design, we can see we need to lower this router bit 1/8 of an inch. So I'll zero it at this point, and then lower it down until it reads 0.125. And set the stop. Now we'll slide the carriage down to 31 inches and lock it on the x-axis lead screw. Now this is quite a bit deeper than the last cut, so we're going to raise it just a little bit, and we'll do it in 2 passes. For the second cut, we're going to turn the handle 4 turns, and that will move the carriage down to 32 inches. And we'll just repeat the same operation. Once we've completed this detail at the bottom, we're ready to cut the mortise at the top. I simply made some marks, a 1/2 inch down from the end here, and 3.5 inches long, and then I laid out the width of the mortise, which is going to be 3/8 of an inch, right in the center of the part. Now we'll position the router at this end, and I've set a stop in the x-axis at this point. So I'll also set one here at this end. We'll set a stop right there on the left of the split nut. Next we'll set the plunge depth. I'm going to drop the bit down until it just touches the surface of the wood, and then we'll zero that out at this point. This stock is 2 inches thick. We're going to set our final plunge depth to 1.1875. That's 1 3/16 of an inch. Next, we'll set up the y-axis stops. And we'll position the router so that it's centered between those two marks and put the stops on the y-axis. When you're cutting a mortise, you can't do it all in one pass. We'll do this in steps, about 1/4 inch per pass, and you'll only want to cut in one direction. Now we'll index at 90 degrees and make the next cut. The last step is to cut the taper. On this machine, we're using the optional Z-axis, so we can tip the bed in either direction. If you're using a plunge router, however, you would definitely want to drop the tailstock in. That means that the small end of the leg would be positioned at the headstock. With the Z-axis, we can do it either direction. So I've lowered the headstock down 1 1/4 inches, and then I'm plunging the bit down until it just touches the surface of the wood at this point. And that'll be my final plunge depth. And this is going to remove a 1/2 inch material down at this end. We wouldn't want to try and do that all in one pass. So I'm going to bring the router bit up to this end, somewhere in the middle, and we'll just plunge down until it touches the surface right here. And we'll machine this first section off, and then we'll work back until we get the final depth. Obviously, the machine can work right around this bead to continue the taper on like this. So there's the square leg with the mortises, and of course the square beads cut at the end and the cove at the top. Well, since the first class, we made two major decisions for this project. Number one, we decided to make it out of walnut instead of maple. And number two, I decided to cut my hair. It was just totally out of control. Now that we've finished the legs, the next step is to make the rails. You have two choices here. You can take your stock and run it through your joiner and your planer and get it all chewed up and then cut it to size. Or you can do the exact opposite. I like to cut the blanks to size first. Then I'll put it in the ornamental mill and I'll plane off one surface. That way I know that I'll have a perfectly flat, smooth surface. At that point I can either flip it over and machine the other side on the mill, or I can take it to my planer, either way. But we know that the part's going to be very true and flat. So I'm going to start off here using the horizontal vices to hold the stock in place. These cams make it very easy to take the parts in and out, and we'll just put that on the bed and then lock this down. Of course, these vices can be set farther apart for longer stock, but this is the shortest piece, so I set it up for this one to begin with. With the stock held securely in place with the clamps, I'm going to take this router bit, it's bit number 2704, it's a surface planing bit, and just plunge it down until it touches the surface of the wood. Now at this point, I'm going to zero my scale and lower the bit down about 15 thousandths of an inch just to skim off that surface. I'm going to start at this front edge and make a pass, and then I'll just move the router bit back a ½ inch at a time for each pass until we mill across the entire face of this board. You notice how we cut from right to left as we start on this front edge and work to the back. And the very last pass, we moved across and cut from left to right. And that keeps us from tearing out the grain on the edge of the wood. At this point, you have two choices. You can either take this stock, simply flip it over, readjust the plunge depth and mill the other surface, or you can take this to your planer. Once you have a nice flat surface to work with on this side, then the planer, of course, will thickness plane it to the correct dimension. I'm just going to use the mill. With the stock planed to the proper thickness, we're going to use the sand flea just to sand the surface very smooth and take off any tool marks. Now the sand flea works like a planer, or a joiner rather. It has a drum sander under this table. So instead of using a blade, we're going to sand this smooth. Now we'll turn this up on its edge and run against the fence to take the saw marks off this part here. Now we'll go ahead and cut the parts to length. This is the front rail, this is the back rail, and this one is for the two ends. Rather than cut it into small pieces and then try to run it through the planer and work with it, I've used it as one long piece and dimensioned it. Now we'll go ahead and cut it to length. Now that we have the rails cut to length, we're going to finish the joinery. And we're going to use a loose tenon on this piece. That means we have a mortise here on the leg, and we're going to cut a matching mortise on the ends of the rails. And then we'll use a loose or a floating tenon to join these together. Let me show you how to set that up. Now I'm going to use the vertical vise. And so we've mounted it onto the bed rails, as you can see here. And then I'm going to take my part and just place inside the vices. And we'll clamp this in place just level with the top of this rail. I laid out the position of the mortise on the end of the rail using a set of dial calipers marking a ½ inch from each end, and then I also laid out the 3/8 wide mortise centered in the stock. I then used a pencil to come in and darken these lines so that I can line the router bit with these lines as we go to cut the mortise. Using a 3/8 diameter 2-flute straight cutter, we'll plunge this bit down until it just about touches the wood, and we'll rotate it so it's perpendicular to the wood and simply line it up the left edge at this position and on the right edge at this position, and then we'll go ahead and set the stops. I'll start by setting the stop on the right-hand side, and then slide the carriage over till the edge of the bit lines up with the line, and then we'll set the stop on this side. Next, I'll set the plunge depth. I'll lower the bit down till it just touches the surface of the wood, and I'll bring it out to the front, zero my scale at this point, and then we're going to lower it 1 inch. And set the stop. Now we'll raise the cutter back up and center it on the marks that we made to line up our y-axis. And then we can go ahead and set stops in this position. Now we're ready to cut the mortise. A good rule of thumb is that you only want to plunge approximately half the diameter or the radius of the bit. This is a 3/8 cutter, so we're going to plunge about 3/16 of the max. It's easier just to go a half a turn, an 1/8 inch for each pass, and we'll only cut in one direction. So I'll start on the right, plunge down 1/8, cut to the left, lift it out, and then repeat that process till we reach the final depth. Now we'll just turn the piece over. Make sure it's level with the top of the rail right there and lock it in place, and we're ready to start cutting. Now we'll go ahead and just repeat this process on the other 3 rails. So there's the 2 mortises, the same length, the same width. The next step is to make the loose tenon stock. To create the loose tenon stock, I took a piece of walnut and I planed it to 3/8 of an inch thick, and then ripped it 3.5 inches wide. And then we set up the router bit with a 3/16 radius roundover, and it has a bearing on it, and we put it onto a router table. Now we'll go ahead and cut all 4 corners. The next step is to take and cut the tenon stock, and on these parts we're actually going to miter one side on a 45-degree angle. Now we're going to go ahead and do a dry fit. I'll insert the tenon stock with the miter inside of the leg, because those 2 pieces are going to join together and glue together inside of the leg. We'll take the short piece and put it between 2 of the legs. And then we'll go ahead and take the longer rails, stand them up, and we can put these in the legs or in the end of the rails. It doesn't really matter. And then attach the top legs. For the tabletop, taken some 3/4 stock and glued 2 pieces together, and then cut the table 12 1/8 inches wide by 26 3/8 of an inch long. Now we'll go ahead and do an edge treatment using the router table. For the top edge, we're going to use this 3/16 radius roundover with a bearing. This is the same cutter we use to create the loose or floating tenons. For the bottom edge of the table, we'll use a 1-inch diameter core box bit, and we have raised it 3/8 of an inch. To finish the tabletop, I'm going to use the sand flea to give us a nice, beautiful finish rather than sand it by hand. We're now ready to glue up the table and put a finish on it. In the next class, we are going to build the cabinet.